Today we'll be looking at the clunky, chunky robots from the future and seeing what these Kastelans can do for us in-game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we're continuing in our series on the Adeptus Mechanicus, looking at the various units and datasheets throughout the codex, and it's the turn of the Kastelan robots to be put under the microscope. So in this video we're going to take a look at their datasheets, a discussion of their buffs and synergies within the Admech codex, and how I would personally use them in-game in a game of 40k. In the background, the Kastelan robots are ancient, commonly used Imperial robots, utilised exclusively by the Adeptus Mechanicus' Legio Cybernetica. The majority of these robots have been around for thousands upon thousands of years, some predating the Imperium itself. In battle, the Kastelan robots tower over the battlefield, standing at over twice the height of a man, an unstoppable force of adamantium might. They can deploy heavy firepower via Heavy Phosphor Blasters, or be fitted for close combat duty with mighty Kastelan fists. Incoming fire is met by their repulsor grid, an energy field capable of redirecting and reflecting the majority of oncoming shots. Despite their might, Kastelan robots do have to be closely supervised by the attendant datasmith. Once set on a course of action, they will continue upon that course of action until told otherwise. When left to their own devices, they'll purposefully continue in the same task, whether that's marching purposely forward directly into a lake of lava, or continuing to slaughter through the entire populace of a city, even once the enemy resistance has been utterly crushed. So let's see what these unthinking automata can do on the tabletop then, with a look at their datasheet. So in-game, Kastelan robots are a heavy support choice for Codex Adeptus Mechanicus, and they'll either cost you 100 points when equipped with Kastelan fists, or 110 points when equipped with twin Heavy Phosphor Blasters. Interestingly enough, the unit must always contain 2 Kastelan robots, presumably because they're sold that way, and it can be increased up to a unit of 6 Kastelan robots, so you can really get quite a big chunky unit out of them. For that 100 to 110 points, they actually have a fairly meagre defensive profile. They're movement 8, weapon skill and ballistic skill 4+, strength 6, toughness 7, 6 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 10, and a 3+ save. So in general they're not going to have morale issues even with slightly bigger squads. They're reasonably tough, reasonably fast for walkers, but they're not all that accurate with ballistic skill 4+, and they've only got 6 wounds. However, their repulsor grid does come in handy for defense. It gives them a 5+ invul save, and also if you are saving on the invul save and you roll a 6 to save for it, then the unit that made the attack suffers a mortal wound. I guess the imagery is reflecting it directly back at the opponent, but it can lead to some fairly silly situations, say if a las cannon's fired from the other side of the board. Supposedly the repulsor grid can bounce it directly back all the way to the other side of the battlefield if you roll a 6. So in terms of armament, in the cheaper loadout it has Kastelan fists and an Incendiary Combustor. The Kastelan fists are strength +4, AP -3 and flat damage 3, so typically strength 10 and will chew through some armoured targets. Now with only 3 attacks this would usually be quite underwhelming, but they can easily fight twice with Conqueror Protocol as we'll see in a second. On average though, against a typical vehicle armoured target, you can expect to get around about 1 wound through per Kastelan robot, so a unit of 3 will typically do something like 8 or 9 damage on the target. Obviously in multiples of 3. That Incendiary Combustor that they're also armed with is essentially a heavy flamer, but with 12-inch range, so it could be a pretty fearsome prospect if you are trying to charge a unit of these guys, or just allowing them to clear out a bunch of light infantry. This Incendiary Combustor can be swapped out for a Heavy Phosphor Blaster, which I would do if I was fielding it in the shooty variant, but I think if I was using it as the close combat variant I would keep the Incendiary Combustor, because if you're moving then you're going to be hitting on 5s with the Heavy Phosphor, which just isn't very impressive at all. Now Heavy Phosphor Blasters got a weird points change in the engine war leaks that we've seen. For no good reason Games Workshop appeared to list them as 0 points, which would change things quite a bit for these Kastelan robots, as in theory you could have a Kastelan robot for 65 points with 3 Heavy Phosphor Blasters, thereby just about getting to be some of the cheapest, most efficient firepower in the whole game. For the purposes of this review I'm going to assume that that was an error, and we'll be using their 15-point loadout, as I strongly suspect it will be FAQ'd to. That means that you can field a Kastelan robot with 3 Heavy Phosphor Blasters for 110 points, and each one of those Heavy Phosphors is Heavy 3, Strength 6, AP -2 and Damage 1, and as they're Phosphor weapons, they get to ignore cover as well. Again, it's okay firepower. Each robot with no buffs and firing once would kill about 3 Orc Boys or put 2 wounds on Space Marines, but it's hardly excellent for 110 points. If you're going to be using them as firepower, they really need to be firing twice in their Protector Protocol. So what about these protocols then? These are basically 3 very powerful buffs that you can choose to have your Kastelan robots have. These are the Aegis Protocol, Conqueror Protocol and Protector Protocol, and when you set them up they're very helpfully in the Aegis Protocol. which adds 1 to their armor and vulnerable saving throws that you make for the models in the units. This is pretty excellent survivability wise, as it means they essentially have a 2+ save and a 4+ invul save if your opponent happens to be going first and is trying to remove them from the table. With such a high invul save as well, it might often mean that you're forced down to it with any las cannons or things, so it gives you a little bit more chance of reflecting those mortal wounds. Basically, at the start of each of your movement phases, you can attempt to change the battle protocol with their support character, the Cybernetica Datasmith, if he's within 6 inches of the unit. I believe if you have multiple units of Kastelan robots, then one Datasmith can choose the protocols for each of them, and he needs to make a roll of a 2+, and then it's successful in changing the protocol from the previous one. Needless to say, it could well be worth a command reroll if you're, say, changing them from Aegis Protocol to Protector Protocol, as that's going to be a massive difference as to the amount of shooting you get out of them. So already Aegis is pretty solid, but what about the 2 others then? The Conqueror Protocol basically means when it's in effect, the unit can't shoot, but it can fight twice in each fight phase instead of only once. Now, innate fighting twice is just such a useful ability to have. Because you do the entire sequence of fighting again, it means that you can actually gain a whole load of movement in the fight phase as well, as you'll both pile in, fight and then consolidate, and you can get up to quite a lot of tricks with that, particularly putting them on objectives or tying up other enemy units. This also means that if you had a bunch of robots with Kastelan fists and they wiped out a target after they charged, you'd still be able to nominate them to fight again, and that will just mean a 6-inch movement towards other enemy units should you want it. It is a little bit of a shame to lose those Incendiary Combustor shots, and if you are fighting against chaff hordes, you could just think about keeping them in Aegis, so you get the advantage of using the Combustors and also just having them fight once. I think the real star of the show for these guys though is their Protector Protocol, which basically is the one that you want with the Heavy Phosphor Blaster loadout, and basically when this protocol is in effect, you can't move or charge, but you can double the number of shots that it makes with each of its ranged weapons. This is pretty insane. It means that one Kastelan robot that would typically be putting out 9 shots with Heavy Phosphor Blasters is putting out a whopping 18 shots for 110 points. The protocol doesn't allow it to move though, so it's really quite inflexible. Basically your Kastelan is going to be rooted to the spot until this is changed, so it means that if your opponent is playing cleverly, then they might be able to either outrange, hide from it, or potentially even think about trying to lock it up in close combat where it won't even be able to fall back unless you're able to change the protocol. I think I'll just mention now that we do have a stratagem as well to help affect these protocols. There's one called Binaric Override, which allows you to use it at the end of any phase to change the battle protocols of your Kastelan robots for 1 command point, at the downside that you can never change the battle protocols again for the rest of the game. So you might be giving up tactical flexibility later, but with the potential to get so much extra damage output or other advantages out of the unit, then it could be worth it. You could use this, for example, to use Aegis Protocol to allow them to move, and then use it at the end of the movement phase to switch them to Protector Protocol to double the firepower of all their guns, at the downside that they'd be locked in place for the rest of the game. Or say you could be moving up to charge into close combat, you could be in Aegis Protocol so you could fire all of those Incendiary Combustors, and then use this for 1 command point to lock them into Conqueror Protocol for the rest of the game, making them just melee monsters, but very good ones at that. I think this one could be really quite an interesting tactical decision, as it could allow you to benefit from multiple of these protocols in one turn. In terms of other special rules, they of course have Canticles of the Omnissiah. Shroud Psalm can be particularly potent with these guys, particularly on the first turn when they're in Aegis Protocol, as 2+ save and cover is going to be a nightmare to shift for virtually anything. Benediction of the Omnissiah can of course be good for shooting units, though typically being shooting castle units they're usually going to be quite easy to support with the Tech Priest Dominus, and they could be one of the better targets for Chant of the Remorseless Fist if you've chosen to equip them for melee. Finally, be aware that they do explode. If you roll a 6 when they die, then units within 3 inches suffer D3 mortal wounds, so it's small range but quite potent in the explosion. Before we move on, I thought we'd take a quick look at the Cybernetica Datasmith's profile. This guy's 41 points, and it's basically a little support character armed with a power fist and a gamma pistol. Naturally, his primary purpose is going to be to change the Kastelan robots' protocols if they need to, but he can also specifically heal Kastelan robots for D3 wounds a turn, though he can't do it for anything else unlike the other tech priests. And that gamma pistol is actually a pretty reasonable weapon if the enemy does get close to them. It's a one-shot 12-inch pistol with strength 6, AP 3, damage 2, and you can reroll failed wound rolls if you're targeting a vehicle. It's not going to change the world, but you've got a very good chance of shooting one thing dead. He's not the easiest to remove with sniper fire, which is pretty handy. He's toughness 4, 4 wounds, and has a 2+ save and a 5+ invul. So compared with a lot of characters, he is at least relatively safe. Typically I think it's a good idea to have one of these guys if you are running one or more units of Kastelan robots, just to allow them to be able to switch between shooting and moving, just in case your Kastelan castle is completely outranged or outmaneuvered, or even locked up in combat. I guess you could theoretically be gutsy if you had just one small unit of 2, and say just use the stratagem to lock them into either Protector or Conqueror protocols for the entire game, but that will make them very tactically inflexible and not be able to use their other options throughout the course of it. I guess it depends whether that flexibility is going to be worth saving the 41 points on this guy at the expense of 1 CP. So let's talk about getting a little bit more out of these units on the table then. I personally think that Mars and Styges are some of the best options for the shooty Kastelans. Mars has access to more chance of getting the right canticle of the Omnissiah, plus Belisarius' Call is an absolutely great combo with these guys. Basically being able to reroll all hit rolls means that they'll be getting a lot more out of him due to only having a ballistic skill of 4+ in normal circumstances. There's certainly a reason that these Kastelan robots and Call made quite a big splash at the start of 8th edition just for the amount of firepower they could put out, even if it was a bit inflexible. On top of that now from Engine War, Mars' unique canticle of the Omnissiah can get them to strength 7 with the Phosphor Blasters, which is actually really quite a big deal against toughness 7 vehicles, which are one of the more common targets in the game. On top of all that, just the sheer amount of shots that they can put out, they're an excellent target for Wrath of Mars. Theoretically, if you went absolutely nuts with the units, then you could have 108 shots out of them, and if they were standing next to Call, then that's an average of 81 hits, which would give you an mortal wound output for Wrath of Mars of 13 or 14 mortal wounds. Not bad for a 2 command point stratagem. Obviously that is tying up a whole load of points of your army in one massive unit, but it's certainly something that has been done in the past throughout 8th edition. Other than that, Styges functions very well as well. Being -1 to hit is a really big boon to the defensive profile for these things, as point for point they just really aren't all that tough compared with some of our other options. Styges are also pretty interesting for the Plea of the Veiled Hunter, their unique Forge World specific canticle, which can allow you to fall back and shoot, albeit at -1 to hit, which counts as a major weakness of their shooting version of these guys. In addition, their stratagem could be pretty handy on the melee version of these robots. Allowing them to move up before the game even begins is pretty powerful, and certainly will shorten the amount of turns it takes before they get into close combat. Visor will of course give you a little bit of extra damage output in close combat for the melee version, and a Grippenar could get some fierce overwatch out of the shooty version, although if you're letting someone charge this castle, then something's gone horribly wrong. It'd be absolutely the last thing that you want for a giant shooty castle of death like these guys. The new custom Forge Worlds have a couple of really interesting traits for these guys as well. Specifically the Data Horde Forge World, which gives vehicles such as these guys a 6+ Feel No Pain type save, which does help out with their slightly weaker durability, and you can stack that with the second half of their potential benefit, which allows them to further heal 1 wound per turn as well, which you could potentially combine with the Datasmith's healing, meaning that if you don't kill one of the Kastelans, it's going to regenerate quite a lot of wounds. I could imagine these guys being an absolute pain to shift, though of course you have to think about the opportunity cost of Styges, as -1 to hit will be a better durability buff against lower ballistic skill armies without access to full Chapter Master style rerolls. In terms of character support, we've already mentioned that Call is excellent, the Dominuses can also heal them and give them reroll 1s, and Tepres Manipuluses can be good for either the shooting or the combat variant for a little bit of extra movement and charging, or extra range on their guns, which can be really helpful once they are rooted in place. 36 inches just really isn't all that long a range, and boosting that up to 42 on a fairly immobile platform is really quite a big deal. Obviously we've already talked about the Datasmith, who I would typically bring along as well. If I was thinking about building a shooting castle, I'd certainly think about some of those Holy Order Warlord traits. The one for extra hits on 6s, and the one for extra AP on 6s certainly stack well on the Phosphor Blasters, and alternatively there is one for re-rolling charges, again to try and get those Kastelan fists into close combat. Now the Kastelans do have one of their own Vigilus formations in the Cybernetica cohort. This specialist detachment affects Kastelan robots, tech priests, and datasmiths, and allows a few interesting extra options for buffing them. Their Warlord trait, which you can buy in for 1 command point with the Field Commander stratagem, allows Kastelan robots to be healed up to D6 wounds rather than D3, which does have the potential to be very powerful, but bear in mind that these guys only have 6 wounds, so you're never ever going to be able to heal them 6 wounds, and there's a very good chance that your opponent might not actually injure but not kill any of them, so you might not be able to heal them at all. The D3 might be fine. Potentially very powerful in the right circumstances, but I certainly wouldn't say it's mandatory. The D3 repairs are already very good on these 6 wound critters. The relic's a bit underwhelming, it just gives datasmiths a little bit of extra range to their battle protocols. I'd personally not bother with that, you can just have him standing within 6 inches pretty happily. and they've got access to a couple of extra stratagems, including Power Surge for 1 CP, which allows you to add 3 to the charge rolls of a Kastelan robot unit, provided they're right next to a Cybernetica Datasmith within 3 inches. I think this is an absolutely excellent stratagem for a fighter unit with the fists, and could well be worth including the formation to access. Finally, we have a 1 command point stratagem called Strafing Fire, which is used when they're in Aegis Protocol, and it means that they can treat their heavy weapons as assault weapons for all rules purposes. Basically, this is the one if you have to redeploy your Kastelan robots, they're in Aegis Protocol, and it means you can move them and still hit on 4s with those Heavy Phosphor Blasters, rather than having to hit on pathetic 5s. Again, I'm sort of in 2 minds about this one. It will make their firepower a lot stronger if they need to redeploy, but it's still going to be at least reasonably underwhelming firepower compared with what they might be able to achieve if they were standing still. For me, I think if I was using a big unit of fighty Kastelans, I'd most certainly use this formation to be able to access Power Surge, and if I was using an enormous Death Star of them, I'd think about getting it to access the Strafing Run one, but I'm not sure I'd bother if I was just using a small unit or 2. In terms of more generic stratagems that we can use on them, the Kastelan robots have Elimination Volley, which is their proximity with the Kastelan Destroyers option, to give both units +1 to their hit rolls for 2 CP. This one's one of the strongest stratagems in the Admech Codex, as it gives 2 units a really quite massive damage boost, particularly as both of these guys can be horrendously efficient in firepower already, even outside of this stratagem. This one really helps with the Kastelan robots' low ballistic skill, getting them to hit on 3s is excellent. Never mind the awesome plasma fire that can be coming out of the Kastelan destroyers, which this stratagem will even keep them safe from, for being +1 to hit. The existence of this really makes Kastelan destroyers and Kastelan robots excellent units to take together in the same list, and if you're going big on one of these 2, then I think it's well worth including at least a small unit of the other type, just so you can access this stratagem and help them both out so much. Say if we had a unit of 3 Kastelans firing on Protected Protocol for 54 Phosphor Blaster shots, typically even with no other buffs at all, and we can stack them very high with buffs, then they'll still put about 12 wounds on things like Primaris Space Marines. With the stratagem, that'll go up to around about 16 wounds, so with the stratagem you're putting an extra 4 wounds on fairly hard targets. Never mind the other half of the stratagem, which is going to boost the Cataphrons. It's just a really excellent value command point to damage stratagem. We already mentioned Binaric Override, the one to change their protocols and keep it locked for the rest of the game. Could be handy if you lose your Datasmith somehow. There's the potential to use Benevolence of the Omnissiah for 1 command point to give them a 5+ Feel No Pain against mortal wounds. Quite a reasonable choice on these guys, as they're quite expensive point per wound, and mortal wounds are quite effective against them. If you are sending them into the heart of the fray with some Kastelan Frists, I certainly remember Machine Spirit's Revenge. If they are killed in close combat, then you could hand out a few mortal wounds to everyone around you, just for 1 command point. So how would I personally use these guys in game then? For me, out of the 2 variants, I do much prefer the shooty variant of the Kastelans myself. I just feel they're not all the most tough unit in the world, and I'm just not sure that point for point that they're likely to survive to get into close combat, and I feel that other units in the Adeptus Mechanicus Codex, such as the Sindonian Dragoons, just do this a lot better. So generally, I'd typically be wanting to look at the triple Heavy Phosphor Blaster Kastelans, buffed up with all the shooting buffs that we have available, to be able to be part of a decent shooting castle. I think honestly you could justify pretty much any unit size of these that you wanted. If you're using Katephron destroyers, I certainly think about a small unit of 2 of these guys, just to have that synergy with the Elimination Volley, so that both units can massively benefit. You could almost treat them as a support unit for those destroyers if you really wanted to. Otherwise, with increasing the unit size, you do get some benefits, but you get some downsides as well. A larger unit of Kastelans is going to be better in Overwatch, just due to having more guns pointed at the enemy, and it's going to be a lot better for using any shooty stratagems on them, such as that Elimination Volley or Wrath of Mars. However, if you did take 6 of them, that's 1/3 of your army right in points in 1 unit, and it's really quite dangerous to have that much in 1 unit, just in case the enemy manages to counter it quite well. They could potentially be outranged, or have things hide out of line of sight from them for a turn or 2, and unless you're playing some sort of army that has an option for getting them out of close combat, then if someone does manage to cleverly engage them with close combat, say by charging something next to them and then piling into them, then he might just have lost an absolutely enormous amount of shooting, just due to that opponent's clever move. So basically huge units will get you the best return on firepower, but do have the potential for some nasty counters. I'd say some middle-sized units seem perfectly reasonable, maybe 3 or 4 Kastelans. They'll still be spitting out an absolutely enormous amount of shots downrange, but maybe not quite as much of a disaster if they do get locked up or something. For the shooty variant, deployment is going to be the biggest challenge for these guys. They want to make sure that their guns have range and line of sight, and they're only reasonably short range as well at 36 inches. which means that you're going to be wanting to deploy them somewhere centrally in your deployment zone, maybe not too far back just so they don't get outranged. From there they are likely to be fairly static due to you wanting to stay still and use the Protector Protocol, which means that you both want them to be incredibly well screened. You don't want anyone getting in close combat with them or even able to make a charge if you can avoid it, but you don't want them to be too far back that they're irrelevant. I'd hopefully be trying to set them up with various buffing characters. I'd most certainly think about buying in some of those Holy Order Warlord traits for extra shooting, stacked on a Dominus and a Manipulus Tech Priest to give them extra range and reroll ones, just to make sure that they can engage their targets and get an additional buff to their shooting. If you've got Castelan Destroyers, certainly think about putting them nearby. Maybe have the Castellans hide out of line of sight in a ground floor ruin, and then use their infantry keyword to move up to get line of sight turn 1, remain within 6 inches of the Castellans, and then absolutely blow the enemy to shreds. Just theoretically, if we did have Belisarius Core and a Tech Priest Manipulus bearing that Holy Order Warlord trait for extra hits on 6s, and we use the Elimination Volley stratagem on these guys, with a big unit of 6 for 108 shots, we'd typically be putting something along the lines of 40 wounds on Toughness 7 vehicles, or over 50 wounds on Primaris Space Marines. I know that formation is a good chunk of your entire army, but it really is an insane amount of firepower, and you could even stack something like Wrath of Mars on top of that. They certainly have the potential to be incredibly scary. In terms of the Kastelan Fist armed variants, again I think I'd be pretty flexible in how many I could take with them. Probably a mid-sized unit, anywhere between 2 and 4 of them, as to be fair you're already committing quite a lot of resources just having 2 on the table for 200 points. These guys would need to be starting right on the front of the deployment zone, as you don't want the enemy just falling back away from them and having them completely ignored for 2 or 3 turns. With that formation, I'd certainly think about buying in the Vigilus formation to allow you the plus 3 inches to charge, and I'd certainly consider doing that move where you keep them in Aegis Protocol to keep them safe as they move up, and then use Binaric Override after you've just got right close to the enemy, fired off all of your Incendine Combustors, and just lock them into Conqueror Protocol for the rest of the game. Naturally, you'd be looking to just charge down enemy tough units, and then use the Fight Twice ability to hopefully pile into other enemy threats, or just gain even more movement towards the enemy if you do wipe out your targets. Overall, I'd say that Kastelan robots are a pretty strong unit in the Admech army, and I think they're an interesting tactical choice just because they do have significant advantages, but they also have significant choices to make and significant disadvantages depending on what protocol you're putting them in. Certainly not quite as flexible as some of our other choices, but they make up with that for a lot of raw might. If you've got any thoughts or ideas about using these guys in game, then please let me know down in the comments below. It'd be good to hear your thoughts. And feel free to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more Adeptus Mechanicus reviews. We'll have plenty more coming out over the next few weeks. If you've been enjoying the channel recently, I'd just like to mention my Element Games affiliate link, which is down in the description below. Basically, if you were thinking about ordering in some models at any time in the future, and you live in the UK, then Element Games is an excellent discount retailer that gives around 10 to 20% off 40k models. If you buy something after clicking the link in the description, then a small amount of the money goes to Auspex Tactics without costing you any more. So if you were thinking about buying in some models anyway, then it can be a way to help support the channel. I do also have a similar link for Amazon in the USA and Canada, where you can also buy the vast majority of Games Workshop's products. That works in a similar way. Just click the Amazon link, and then any purchases on Amazon within the next 24 hours, a small amount goes to help support the channel. A big thank you to you guys who have been using these. It really does help justify me making all these videos about model soldiers. In any case, a big thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.